We want to welcome on this Memorial Day Monday Mary Alice Herbert, who lives now in Putney, Vermont, and is the vice presidential candidate for the Socialist Party USA. Good morning. Thanks for being with us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Why are you running?
Well, I'm running because I believe that the one thing that we lack in this country is economic democracy, and I feel as though, I feel as though the capitalist system is incapable of giving us economic democracy. And I feel as though this is a time when we need to be thinking about changing the way we live.
What is economic democracy?
Well, economic democracy would be a system where we don't have working poor, where anyone who has a job can make a living. I saw homeless men sleeping under tarps, in the park as I walked by, and people stopped to ask me for money. People stopped me to ask for money. That's a sign that we don't have economic democracy in this country. The problem with capitalism is that we put profits above people, and we put we put ecology last. So our environment's being despoiled. We're running on finite resources. We're going to have to learn how to live a different way once we no longer have oil, because this country has become the one remaining superpower, and is trying to establish an empire in order to control these dwindling resources, so that not only can the United States have them, but we can control who else gets them in the rest of the world. I feel as though 9/11 was an event, sort of like Pearl Harbor was for World War II, that persuaded the American people to join the war, to wholeheartedly support World War II. That 9/11 and the war on terrorism is a cover for this establishment of a world empire.
Are profits bad?
Well, I think that we could live in pretty much if you define profits as what is left over after you have paid your workers a living wage, after workers have gotten a living wage, and depreciation, improvements in the factory or whatever. When you count all that in, if there is a lot left over, then either and that's what profit would be. The money that's not needed for continuing to keep the business running, having enough to continue to pay the workers. So I think that we have a distinction between personal property and private property. And what the Socialist Party opposes is private property, which means that income-producing concerns should be held by the people who work in them. I mean, it should be worker-owned and worker-controlled.
Our guest is Mary Alice Herbert, who is a graduate of High Point College in North Carolina, earned her master's at Antioch College, lives in Vermont, and in 1996 ran against a now former governor of that state.
That's right, yes. And I scolded him. I got, the press called me the kindergarten teacher who wants to teach the governor a lesson. The Democratic wing of the Democratic Party in Vermont had proposed a single-payer health plan for the state. And it looked pretty good, but I think maybe Governor Dean didn't think it would work, so he opposed that. I was given some information about contributions he'd gotten from healthcare companies, and had fun sort of brandishing those in front of the camera during an interview. And also, as a result of NAFTA, Vermont was seeing companies from Canada come across the border. And there was a giant egg farm that had located just across the border to produce eggs for resale in Canada. And the problem was that it was like a factory farm, and our environmental laws hadn't really quite covered how to deal with factory farms at that time, because we hadn't had any in Vermont. But the problem was it was so highly mechanized, it supplied very few local jobs. And then also it really wreaked havoc for the dairy farmers in the neighborhood because of the runoff and the flies that were produced. Well, I would explain that by saying that if production is really based on what people need, and certainly we know there are a lot of things that people need, the economy could certainly provide, whether you consider it profit or whether you consider it just an excess of income, enough income to provide the things that people need. The big problem with the market system is that it satisfies rich people's wants before it ever gets around to poor people's needs. So we feel as though production for use, we want production to be controlled by those who work in it, and we want people to receive a living wage.
Who is Walt Brown?
Walt Brown is a retired lawyer. He was in the U.S. Navy and a lawyer for the Navy who worked for a long time in Washington, D.C. He is a longtime member of the Socialist Party. He lives in Lake Oswego, Oregon.
And how did he become the presidential nominee?
At the same convention last October, he was chosen among several other presidential hopefuls, or nominee hopefuls, and then he was chosen to be the presidential candidate, and I was chosen to be the vice presidential candidate.
There's an article this morning by Howard Kurtz. It's in the style section of today's Washington Post. It says, in Boston and New York, predictable coverage for predictable conventions, and in essence he says the entire thing in New York and Boston will be scripted. Yesterday we were live for several hours and had to extend our coverage because the Libertarian Party had not one, not two, but 3 ballots before they determined who was going to be the Libertarian Party nominee. How do you compare the two?
You're right, because we already know who the nominees are for the business parties. There were several ballots at the Socialist Party convention too.
So what's the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans and third parties where they have multiple ballots before figuring out who they will select?
I think that our nominees don't have to be as homogenized and sort of, we don't have to be kind of come up through the process that I think maybe candidates who have to be so careful in satisfying all sorts of interests do.
I used this in the earlier half hour, but I want to get your reaction. $154 million is what the DNC had said they would add to the economy of Boston, but Boston will also lose about $50 million because of traffic losses caused by subway and traffic tie-ups.
So it's somewhat of a gain for Boston, but yeah.
And it's a shame.
Thank you, caller. We will move on. Did you want to respond?
Yes, I do, because I feel really glad to be in Washington, D.C. right now when the memorial to World War II and to the greatest generation is being opened. And as I've been traveling, I've seen veterans, veterans who are on their way there. Now, that era, World War II era, probably comes the closest to a time of somewhat of economic democracy of any era. I was a child during World War II, and I remember the kind of cooperation that went on. There were wonderful daycare centers for Rosie, the riveters, and the many women who worked in the plants that because men had to be overseas, and then during that period, so there was an element of cooperation and an element of all of us in society pulling together to meet this challenge. And after the war, when those brave men came back to the United States, they were treated so much more respectfully, so much better than veterans who return now are. When they came back, they had the GI Bill. Many of them were the first people in their families to have ever gone to college. The policies of this government at that time helped create and expand, helped create a new middle class. The men who came back from World War II, by virtue of getting an education, they were able to become homeowners, and there was an era of real prosperity that was engendered by tax policies. Previous to the war, FDR had enacted just about everything that had been on the Socialist Party platform, advocated by Eugene V. Debs from the turn of the century. Old age insurance for workers who could no longer work, Social Security, unemployment compensation, works programs that put people to work. Those were things that the socialists had been advocating for a long time, and those have made life better for Americans.
Our guest is Mary Alice Herbert, who is the vice presidential nominee for the Socialist Party USA. And if you want to get more information, you can log on to the website at www.sp-usa.org, which is also linked through C-SPAN's website.
I think that this is a time, since we know that fossil fuels are on the way out, because we've pretty much discovered all the known reserves, and that in the future we're going to be needing to use other forms of energy to continue our civilization. Some kind of works program that would really explore and develop green energy sources. Plants could be put back to work, idle plants could be put back to work, retooled to produce the parts needed for green energy, for windmills, for solar, for all of the ways that we're going to have to, the sources we're going to be having to depend on in a generation or two. It seems as though what's hard for capitalism to do is to look to the future. It's always having to worry about, about the short term. Let's see, I'm losing my train of thought here. But
well, let's go to the next call. And
okay.
Thank you, caller.
I think who was it? There was a governor's wife who said that originally a long time ago in Texas. I can't remember what her name was, but that's a funny line. Well, the Socialist Party is really opposed to nuclear energy because we feel as though it's not really safe. Nuclear plants are can be terrorist targets. There are always things that can go wrong. We feel as though we shouldn't be depending on nuclear energy. And I think the reason that socialism has failed, certainly the kind of socialism that they were aiming for in the Soviet Union, never arrived, because I think socialism is not something that can be imposed from above. And what we advocate is democratic socialism, which begins with where you live, where you work, and with your community. And in the early part of this century, there were a lot of socialists elected to local office. There were towns that had socialist mayors, and I think that Berkeley, California was one. Milwaukee has a long history of having had socialist government. Reading, Pennsylvania is another. What we're talking about is the kind of socialism that begins locally and then extends its way up.
What does it mean to be pro-choice and anti-capitalist, as your button indicates?
Well, this was the button that we wore when we marched in the March for Women's Lives in Washington, D.C.
First of all, taxes.
Well, we believe that the wealthy should certainly be paid. They should not be given tax rebates, as our present government is doing. It's a privilege to be an American and to live in this country. And we feel as though Actually, if taxes were being collected at the rate they were about income taxes about 2 decades ago, before the Reagan administration began lowering them and shrinking the middle class, we would have quite a lot of money for social programs.
So if a wealthy American is defined as somebody who makes more than $200,000 a year, what should his or her tax rate be?
Well, let me see. I think that socialists in our platform, similar to what I think the Greeks thought, is that the highest paid people in a society that should make no more than about 10 times as much as the average. And by average, I mean a decent living wage. So I would say that the tax rates could be a lot low, would not have to be, for incomes of that sort, tax rates would not have to be much higher than they are now for people at that level, or maybe a little less.
And on the military, specifically with the war in Iraq, what's the Socialist Party viewpoint?
We want those, we would like the troops, we'd like that occupation to end now. I think that there are many well-educated people in Iraq. I read recently that there are more PhDs per capita in Iraq than there are here. Those folks could put their country back together. Also, I want to talk about Social Security and a little bit more about corporations.
This email from Jeff in Los Angeles, what does Ms. Herbert define as a living wage?
Well, actually, the Socialist Party would, I think the minimum wage should be up to at least $12 to $14 an hour.
And another email, if your policies were adopted, wouldn't private capital flee to less regulated markets?
That certainly is a problem. And I think that maybe we would just have to hope that some of the people who have made their fortunes in America would be patriotic enough to stay here. I mean, actually, during World War II, the wealthy were quite patriotic. They paid an extra war tax on top of the already steeper income taxes that were in effect during that era. They paid a war tax in order to help with World War II.
And this email from a viewer who says, promotion of socialism is the epitome of ignorance. Socialism has been proven a failure many times. Brains are for a purpose. Think. Let's go to Ottawa, Illinois and get a call. Good morning.
Okay. I think that it's no accident that the United States ranks 139th in voter participation among the countries of the world. I think that it's because we already know the outcome. We know that we know that if we vote for, we're always voting for the lesser of two evils. And I feel as though since capitalism is really incorporates the greed that human people have, that the engine of capitalism is greed, and as the caller before mentioned, that questioned my education, I think the thing is that a much higher degree of education is needed for the kind of citizenship and participation needed in a socialist society. And I think that's been one of the problems. One of the reasons that maybe when socialism has been imposed by force or from above, it hasn't worked. When socialism has been tried and been surrounded by a sea of capitalism, which is constantly embattling it, it's been hard for it to work.
Walt Brown is the presidential nominee for the Socialist Party, and Mary Alice Herbert is the vice presidential nominee. Our next call is Bellevue, Nebraska. Good morning.
Well, I'm sorry. I mean, this is the first time I've been on national television, and I guess I'm a little bit nervous.
We appreciate you coming. And one other email from a radio listener who was listening on WCSP here in Washington. I heard your guest talking about homeless men sleeping in the park on her way to the studio. Does she think that advocates for the homeless who raise money to help the homeless but keep the money to run their organizations and give the homeless donated food could be part of the problem, that these organizations in fact perpetrate the homeless population?
I don't think that's true at all. I think that what makes people homeless is the fact that the jobs they might have had have been shipped overseas. It's hard for people to find a job. We've just been through an economic recovery, and this is the first one since World War II when the share that labor gets is lower than the share that capital gets. Generally, in a classic recovery, labor gets about 65 to 68% of the income, and capital gets the rest. In this one, it's just about reversed. And that shows you that wages in this country are being lowered. Real wages are lowered. If there's time, I want to say one more thing. One of the problems that we have with corporations, the reason that corporations here and in the rest of the world are able to usurp local democracy, is that when the 14th Amendment granting assuring the protection of newly enfranchised black voters and the rights of slaves who had now become citizens, they immediately began to interpret it to have corporations considered as persons. And as long as we have this interpretation of the 14th Amendment, we're going to have difficulty having fair and free elections, because corporations, by being persons, they have First Amendment rights, which mean that they can contribute to political campaigns. In 1976, the Supreme Court decreed that money is speech in elections. So when you think about the amount of power corporations have to control our politicians. And then the Fourth Amendment, the amendment protecting us from illegal search and seizure. Corporations can object if a safety check finds things that are wrong, if it was not announced ahead of time. Anyway, thank you very much.
Mary Alice Herbert, who is a former elementary school teacher, spent 25 years in Brattleboro, Vermont. How will you get back to your home state?
Well, I will, when I leave here, I will go to, I'm on the last day of a 30-day rail pass. I'll go to Union Station, and I'll get on the train and go to Springfield, Massachusetts, and my daughter will come pick me up and take me to Vermont.
Thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Come back again.
Thank you.